Crunch, the sound of a legal document crumpling. A hand, shaking with frustration, tears at a cease and desist letter. They say I have no rights, that the water is theirs, a weary voice narrates. A shadow falls over the dock, now deemed illegal. The voice hardens, a smirk forming. But they forgot to check the land the lake is built on. Because it's not just the water I own. It's their docks, their boats, and their entire perfect little lie. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. A crisp, official-looking thing that felt cold and hostile in Elias Thorne's hands. It was from Aegis Harbor Group, a name he vaguely recognized from the new, sprawling estates that had begun to sprout on the far side of Lake Serenity. He had assumed they were just another company of wealthy outsiders. He was wrong. The lawsuit was against him personally, and the filing was audacious in its scope, a legal claim to the very waters he had grown up swimming in. The document cited ancient easements, shared resource statutes, and a litany of petty complaints from the Lake Serenity homeowners. Association complaints about his unmaintained property, his outdated dock, and the unseemly presence of a public nuisance, disrupting their tranquil, manicured lives. Elias sat on his porch, the letter laid out on the worn, sun-bleached wood. He felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a neighborly dispute. It was a siege. The Thorne family had owned the land at the heart of the lake for generations, a modest cabin and a rocky shoreline that seemed a world away from the manicured lawns and palatial homes now surrounding it. The land was a part of him, a living memory of his grandfather, a man who had been as much a fixture of the lake as the old growth pines. Now this new money, these invaders, were trying to erase that history and him along with it. He'd already had a few run-ins. Mrs. Harding, the self-appointed matriarch of the HOA, a woman whose face was so taut with Botox it resembled a polished marble statue, had cornered him a month ago, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Thorne, we are attempting to establish a unified aesthetic here. Your rustic charm is bringing down our property values." Elias had just smiled and nodded, too tired to argue. He was a caretaker now, not a combatant. But this letter, this lawsuit, was different. It wasn't about an aesthetic. It was an act of war. He drove into town, the old Ford truck rattling in protest. The only lawyer he knew, old Mr. Caldwell, was a man with a penchant for fishing and a disdain for anything more complicated than a property line dispute. He read the lawsuit, his eyebrows disappearing into his white hair. "Elias, this isn't a simple thing. They're not just claiming the water. They're trying to force a sale, to strong-arm you out. Aegis Harbor, they don't mess around." Caldwell shook his head. "They've got a top-tier legal team, Julian Vance. He's a shark. You'll need a retainer just to get his attention, and you'll need more money than you've ever seen to fight him." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He didn't have that kind of money. His grandfather had left him the land, not a fortune. The cabin was paid for, but that was it. He felt the panic rising, a cold dread seeping into his bones. They had him cornered, and they knew it. Back at the cabin, the feeling of helplessness was suffocating. He paced the floorboards, each creak a reminder of a life he was losing. He had to find something. His grandfather, Arthur Thorne, had been a hoarder, a man who believed every piece of paper held a story, a secret. The attic was a labyrinth of dusty boxes, each one smelling of mothballs and history. He started with the oldest-looking chest, a heavy iron-banded trunk that had stood in a corner for decades. Inside, among old fishing lures and faded photographs, were stacks of documents tied with twine and yellowed with age. There were land surveys from the 1920s, handwritten journals detailing his grandfather's purchases, and a jumble of deeds and titles. Elias worked through the night, a single desk lamp illuminating the swirling dust motes. He sorted through the documents, a mountain of legal jargon and forgotten history. He found the original Thorne deed, dated 1928, a thick, vellum document with a seal that had long since crumbled into dust. The language was archaic, almost poetic, but a few lines stood out. It described the property not just as Lot 7 shoreline parcel, but with a bizarrely specific phrase, inclusive of subaqueous rights extending to the deepest point of the lake bed. He reread the phrase. Subaqueous rights. He had no idea what that meant, but it sounded important. He pulled up an old dictionary and an online legal glossary. Subaqueous, existing or occurring underwater. The legal definition of subaqueous property rights was a revelation: ownership of the soil, minerals, and land beneath a body of water. His grandfather hadn't just bought the shoreline. He'd bought the lakebed. He owned the land under the water, not just the water itself. The deed wasn't just a title to the cabin. It was a claim to the very foundation of the lake. The discovery was a flicker of hope, but the lawsuit was still a legal mountain. He continued to search, driven by a renewed energy. He found an old brittle map hand-drawn by his grandfather. It was a detailed survey of the lakebed. But there was something else. A small, separate folder tucked away in the very bottom of the trunk. Inside, he found a document titled Easement and Use Agreement. It was a template, filled out and signed by his grandfather, granting access to the lake to neighboring landowners on a conditional, revocable basis. The crucial condition was that any structures built on the lake, specifically docks, piers, and boathouses, had to be done with the landowner's express written permission, and that those structures were considered transient and movable property of the Thorne family. Elias stared at the document, his mind reeling. His grandfather hadn't just bought the lakebed. He had actively asserted his ownership over it. He had let the neighbors build their docks, their opulent $100,000 boathouses, but he had legally retained ownership of them all. The thought was staggering. He looked back at the lawsuit from Aegis Harbor Group. They were claiming the lake on the basis of shared public access and a supposed lack of Thorne's ownership. The irony was a bitter, exhilarating burn in his chest. The meeting with the Aegis Harbor lawyer and the HOA representatives was set for Friday. Julian Vance, the shark Caldwell had described, was a man who looked like he had been chiseled from a block of granite. Perfectly coiffed hair, a bespoke suit, and a condescending smile. He sat opposite Elias at a polished conference table, flanked by Mrs. Harding and Mr. Davies, the two most vocal members of the association. "Mr. Thorne, let's be frank," Vance began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "Your grandfather's claim to this land is tenuous at best. We have multiple affidavits from longtime residents, notarized and on file, all stating the lake has been a shared resource for generations. We're offering you a fair price to settle this, to avoid a costly and inevitable defeat." "We're trying to be generous," Mrs. Harding added, her voice a pinched whisper. "Frankly, you're in over your head. This could cost you your land, your cabin, everything." Elias felt a calm that surprised him. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold surgical focus. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shuffle in his chair. He just looked at Julian Vance, then at the two homeowners, and finally at the stack of legal documents they had brought. "I appreciate your offer," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "But there's one thing you've overlooked in your research." Vance's smile didn't waver. "And what might that be?" Elias reached into his briefcase and pulled out the old, brittle map. He laid it flat on the table. It was a crude, hand-drawn thing, a stark contrast to the professionally printed surveys on the table. Mrs. Harding snickered. "Is that a treasure map, Mr. Thorne?" Elias ignored her. He took a second document from his briefcase, a copy of the original 1928 deed. "My grandfather, Arthur Thorne, acquired this parcel of land on March 14, 1928. Not just the shoreline, mind you, but the lakebed itself. The deed specifies subaqueous rights extending to the deepest point of the lakebed." The smile on Vance's face flickered, replaced by a subtle shift of his jaw. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, scanning the ancient text. "That's an anachronistic term. We can argue its legal standing in court, Mr. Thorne. It's a very weak foundation." Elias slid the final document across the table. "And this is the easement and use agreement my grandfather drew up, and every single one of your predecessors signed over the years." He pointed a finger at a particular line. "It's a conditional revocable agreement, and it explicitly states that all docks, piers, and structures are considered transient and movable property of the Thorne family." The air in the room went still. Mrs. Harding's face, a mask of entitlement just moments ago, went slack with shock. Mr. Davies looked at his wife, his eyes wide. Julian Vance's face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He looked at the document, then back at them meticulously. Prepared lawsuit they had filed, a lawsuit that contained the HOA's own blueprints of every single dock and boathouse on the lake. Elias picked up their filed documents and ran a finger down a page. He stopped at a beautiful multi-tiered dock with a built-in boat lift, the one belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Davies. "That's a beautiful dock." "Mr. Davies," Elias said, his voice now a low, chilling whisper. "And based on the document you have a copy of in your own files, it's legally mine." He stood up, buttoning his coat. The silence in the conference room was a tangible thing, heavy and filled with the unspoken shock of a losing battle. Elias Thorne's footsteps receded down the hallway, each one a hammer blow to the fragile, pristine world the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association had built for themselves. Julian Vance, the polished, confident attorney, was the first to break the stillness. He picked up the old yellow document with the same distaste one might use to handle a dead rat. This can't be real," Vance said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to Mrs. Harding, his perfectly composed facade cracking. "Did you or your predecessors ever sign anything like this? An easement and use agreement?" Mrs. Harding's face was a study in panicked denial. "Of course not. It must be a forgery. My husband and I have owned our property for 30 years. We have a deed, we have a survey, we have our property value." Mr. Davies, who had remained silent, cleared his throat. "Actually, now that I think about it, my father mentioned something. Said old Mr. Thorne was a real stickler for formalities. Said he had to sign some kind of water rights document when he built the boathouse back in the day. Said it was no big deal. Just a formality? A formality?" Vance's voice rose, a sharp cutting sound that made both of them flinch. He snatched the lawsuit documents and flipped through them, his eyes scanning the detailed blueprints for every dock they had meticulously catalogued. "You've just admitted that a formal agreement exists. An agreement which, according to this artifact," he held up Elias's document, a sneer on his face, "explicitly grants the Thorne family ownership of your structures, not to mention the fact that your own lawsuit has just provided us with a complete inventory of his property. Do you understand what this means?" Mrs. Harding shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It means he'll just tear them down, won't he? Our beautiful docks?" Vance slammed his hand on the table, a sound like a gunshot. "He doesn't have to tear them down, you fool. He could charge you rent. He could sell them. He could just leave them there to rot and sue you for trespassing every time you step foot on them. This isn't about property values anymore. This is about legal leverage, and he has a monopoly on it." The lawyer's rage was a terrifying thing. He had been so sure, so arrogant in his victory, and now he had been utterly humiliated by a man he had dismissed as a backwoods caretaker. "We need to find a way around this," Vance said, his voice dropping back to a cold, predatory whisper. "This agreement is old. The language is archaic. We will challenge it. We will discredit it. We will bury him in legal fees until he has no choice but to sell." He looked from Mrs. Harding to Mr. Davies, his eyes full of a chilling determination. "But we need a new angle, one he won't see coming." Elias Thorne felt no sense of victory as he drove back to the cabin. Only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He hadn't won a war. He had just survived the first battle. He knew a counterattack was coming. He could see it in Julian Vance's eyes, the moment the smugness was replaced by a look of cold, calculating fury. He had exposed their secret vulnerability, and they would not forgive him for it. The next day, a Saturday, the lake was still. The motorboats were silent, the jet skis a collection of colorful fiberglass sculptures tethered to docks that now felt like ticking time bombs. Elias knew they were all talking about it. The whispers would travel the length of the shoreline, carried by the same wind that rustled the pines. He had to be proactive. He couldn't afford to wait for their next move. He spent the morning in the cabin, meticulously copying his grandfather's documents. The language was clear, unassailable. He created a formal notice on his old printer, a simple one-page letterhead that read, "Notice of constructive trespass and demand for reclaim." The letter was concise, citing the original deed, the easement and use agreement, and his legal right to ownership of all transient structures. It demanded that all dock owners contact him within 14 days to enter into a new, formal lease agreement for the use of his property. He didn't mention money, but the implication was clear. That afternoon, Elias took his canoe out, a sense of purpose guiding his paddles. He stopped at every single dock, from the most elaborate floating palaces to the simplest wooden piers, and affixed a copy of the notice to the main support beam. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a quiet act of defiance and reclamation. He saw a few people on their porches watching him with a mixture of confusion and hostility. He just waved. He knew they'd find the notices soon enough. The first call came that evening from a man named Mark, a new resident who owned a sleek, modern home on the east side of the lake. "What is this? Is this some kind of joke?" The man's voice was full of a righteous suburban indignation. "No, it's not," Elias said calmly. "It's a formal legal notice, but you can't do this. I own my dock. I built it myself. I have a permit from the county." Mark's voice rose to a panicked shout. "You have a permit to build on your shoreline property," Elias corrected him. "But the dock is built on my land, on my lake bed." "The permit doesn't grant you ownership of my land. I suggest you read the notice carefully and check your deed. I'll bet your developer has a copy of the agreement I sent you." The line went silent for a long moment before Mark's voice came back, a little softer, a little more defeated. "My God, this is insane!" Over the next 2 days, Elias's phone rang constantly. The calls were all variations of the same theme: shock, outrage, and then a creeping, terrified realization. Most had already been in contact with Julian Vance, who had told them that this was a baseless intimidation tactic. But the sight of the official-looking notice, combined with their frantic searches for a document they had long forgotten, was creating widespread panic. The illusion of a unified, impenetrable front was beginning to crack. Elias watched from his porch as some of the boat owners began to pull their boats off the water, a few even starting to dismantle their docks. The sight filled him with a cold, hollow satisfaction. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man defending his home. On Thursday, the peace was shattered by the arrival of a county vehicle, a pale blue pickup truck with a large official seal on the door. 2 men in uniforms got out, one of them carrying a clipboard. Elias walked out to meet them, his heart pounding a familiar rhythm of dread. "Elias Thorne?" the taller man asked, his voice flat and official. "My name is Officer Jenkins. I'm with the County Land Use and Environmental Services Division. We have a complaint on file regarding your property." Elias's mind raced. What could they possibly complain about now? His grass was cut, his cabin was in good repair. He had broken no law. A complaint? About what? "About public safety hazards on the lake," the officer said, tapping his clipboard. "Specifically, unmaintained transient structures that are a known danger to swimmers and boaters. The complaint cites the old, dilapidated Thorne family dock and others like it." Elias's jaw went slack. The irony was so sharp it almost hurt. They weren't coming for the lake. They weren't even coming for the deeds. They were coming for his own property, the very docks he had just used as leverage. They were trying to force him to dismantle his own family's history piece by piece, or face massive fines. The officer pointed a thumb over his shoulder to a pristine, manicured dock that belonged to Mrs. Harding's son-in-law. "Looks like they've already started the process of upgrading. That's a good first step. But we're here to inspect your property, Mr. Thorne, and if it's found to be in violation, we will be forced to issue you a fine and a mandatory repair order." He smiled then, a small, triumphant little smirk. "Which will apply, of course, to every structure you now claim to own." Officer Jenkins's smirk was a physical thing, a small, triumphant curl of the lips that said more than any verbal threat. "Which will apply, of course, to every structure you now claim to own." The words hung in the air, a final, chilling punctuation mark on their new strategy. Elias felt the familiar, cold dread, but it was sharper this time, infused with a bitter, profound irony. They weren't just attacking his property rights. They were attacking the very act of defiance itself. The county vehicle sat in his driveway like a predatory bird, its blue paint and official seal a symbol of the institutional power arrayed against him. He stood his ground, meeting Jenkins's gaze. "You're saying you'll fine me for every single one of these docks?" "If they are found to be in violation of public safety codes, yes, sir. We have received a comprehensive list of complaints, meticulously detailed by your neighbors. It's our duty to investigate." Jenkins held up the clipboard, the paper rustling like a dead leaf. "We'll begin with your dock first." The audacity was staggering. Elias felt a surge of rage, hot and dangerous, threatening to break through his carefully maintained composure. He wanted to shout, to expose their hypocrisy, to tell them that the docks they deemed unsafe were their own. But he held his tongue. He had to think. They had shifted the battlefield from the legal system to the bureaucratic, a terrain where money and influence could twist local ordinances into weapons. He watched them go, the two officers marching down to his old splintered pier. They took photos, measurements, and scribbled notes on their clipboards, their movements clinical and detached. They were just following orders, but Elias knew exactly whose thumb was on the scales. Julian Vance had found his new angle, a way to bleed him dry with fines and force him into a sale without ever stepping foot in a courtroom. Back inside, he felt the cabin close in on him. The air was thick with the scent of his grandfather's memory, a scent he now feared would be his undoing. He couldn't afford to make repairs on all the docks. He could barely afford the fines for one. He was caught in a trap he hadn't seen coming, a trap of their own making, baited with his own family's history. He sat at the kitchen table. The two legal documents, his grandfather's deed and the easement and use agreement, spread out before him. This wasn't a game of chess. It was a game of cards, and they had just shown him a hand he couldn't beat. He had to find a new card, a hidden ace. He went back to the attic, this time with a specific purpose. He didn't just need legal documents. He needed anything. Any scrap of paper that referenced the lake's history with the county, the town, or any other authority. He spent the rest of the day and a good portion of the night sifting through his grandfather's hoard. He found a jumble of receipts from hardware stores, old fishing licenses, and tax records. Then, in a small battered box labeled Maps and Surveys, he found a manila folder with a handwritten note. Township 4. Lake Serenity Zoning and Regulations. Inside were dozens of pages of faded, mimeographed documents filled with a dense, confusing language that seemed a world away from the present day. These were not legal documents. They were municipal ordinances passed decades ago. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee and began to read, his eyes scanning the fine print, his mind a steel trap absorbing every detail. The documents were dated 1968, a time when Lake Serenity was a quiet fishing spot, not a haven for the wealthy. He found regulations on septic systems, shoreline setbacks, and a section dedicated entirely to lake structures. Most of the language was irrelevant, but one specific clause, buried deep within a paragraph on boathouse construction, caught his eye. It was titled Aesthetic and Safety, Standards for Permanent Structures, and it outlined a series of strict requirements for any new docks or boathouses built after 1968. The ordinance mandated specific materials, widths, and structural supports to prevent visual blight and environmental damage. Elias's heart began to beat a little faster. He looked at the date again, 1968. His grandfather's dock had been built long before that. But what about the others? The multi-tiered floating palaces, the brand-new manicured docks that lined the shoreline. They had all been built in the last 20 years. They were all new permanent structures. He had a gut feeling he was on to something, but he had to be sure. He needed to compare this old ordinance with the meticulous blueprints the HOA had provided to Julian Vance. The next morning, he made a copy of the 1968 ordinance and drove back to the lawyer's office. Mr. Caldwell was surprised to see him. "Elias, what are you doing here? I thought they were going to sue you again." "They've gone a different way," Elias said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "They're using the county. They're trying to fine me into submission for code violations on my own dock." Caldwell's face fell. "Oh, Elias, that's a nasty one. They're a different animal. You can't fight the county in court like you would a civil lawsuit?" "I'm not planning on fighting them," Elias said, his voice calm and resolute. "I'm going to make them fight each other." He laid the old, faded ordinance on Caldwell's desk. "I need you to cross-reference this with the blueprint filings from the HOA's lawsuit. See if any of the new docks are in compliance with this. All of them were built after 1968. Caldwell looked at the document with a lawyer's skepticism, but something in Elias's eyes made him pick it up. He squinted at the text, then at his computer, pulling up the digital files from the lawsuit. He spent the next hour working in silence, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his face a mask of concentration. Elias just waited, the tension in the room growing with every passing minute. Finally, Caldwell leaned back in his chair, a look of profound astonishment on his face. He shook his head slowly, a ghost of a laugh escaping his lips. "My God, Elias, you've done it. You found it. What did I find?" Elias asked, his heart in his throat. "This ordinance, it was superseded years ago by a new, more lenient one, but there's a crucial section here that says any existing permanent structures built after 1968 that do not comply with these aesthetic and safety standards are considered non-conforming. It also states that the County Land Use Division has the authority to issue a mandatory tear-down notice. A tear-down notice, Elias, not a fine. A tear-down notice, Elias repeated, the words tasting like victory. Yes, and I've looked at every single blueprint in this lawsuit. Mrs. Harding's brand new dock, non-conforming. Mr. Davies's boathouse, non-conforming. Every single one of them. They all used a new, more aesthetically pleasing type of composite decking that's explicitly prohibited by the 1968 ordinance for new structures. They were all built under the new, looser regulations. But this old ordinance states that they are still subject to the stricter aesthetic requirements. Elias felt a slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, powerful thing that reached his eyes. He had been playing checkers while they were playing chess, but now he had flipped the board entirely. He was not just holding a deed to their docks. He was holding a government-sanctioned sledgehammer. Julian Vance was holding a press conference at the entrance to Lake Serenity, a small circle of reporters and cameras gathered around him. He was a picture of practiced calm and moral superiority, speaking of public safety and the unfortunate necessity of taking legal action against irresponsible property owners. Mrs. Harding and Mr. Davies stood behind him, their faces a mix of feigned concern and genuine relief. The first fines, they believed, were imminent. As Vance droned on, a familiar rattling truck pulled up behind the crowd. Elias Thorne got out, a single folded piece of paper in his hand. He walked through the press scrum, not saying a word, and stood directly behind Vance, just out of the camera's view. He held the document up for the cameras, a single, faded page with an old town seal and the date 1968 printed at the top. Vance saw him out of the corner of his eye, and his voice faltered, the practiced smile dropping from his face. Elias didn't speak. He just held up the document, his eyes meeting Julian Vance's, a look of serene, terrifying confidence in them. The cameras, sensing the drama, began to pivot away from Vance and onto the man with the piece of paper. The reporters began to whisper, their attention captured by the single, silent act of defiance. Vance, his face now a rictus of shock, and the press scrum, once a tightly controlled audience for Julian Vance's monologue, became a chaotic, snapping mess. Microphones swung wildly, cameras jostled for position, all of them focused not on the polished lawyer, but on the silent man holding a single, faded piece of paper. Vance's face, usually a mask of effortless superiority, was a study in profound public humiliation. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The script had been torn from his hands, and the new director was a man in an old Ford truck. "Mr. Vance, what is that document?" A reporter from a local news channel shouted. "Is it an official county ordinance?" Vance took a step back, his hand fluttering at the collar of his bespoke suit, as if it had suddenly become too tight. I'm not at liberty to comment on unauthenticated documents," he stammered, his voice a pale imitation of the one he had used just moments ago. Elias, still silent, met his gaze, his eyes calm and unwavering. He wasn't there for a fight. He was there to deliver a message. He slowly lowered the paper, folded it, and tucked it back into his jacket pocket. He then turned and walked back to his truck, the cameras and reporters trailing him, shouting questions he did not answer. The last thing he saw was Mrs. Harding and Mr. Davies staring at their lawyer, their faces a mixture of betrayal and dawning terror. He didn't make it 2 miles down the road before his phone began to ring. It was the head of the county land use division, a man named Mr. Thompson. The voice on the other end was not the smug, official tone of Officer Jenkins, but something far more flustered. "Mr. Thorne, we've just seen the broadcast. I've had my team pull the old ordinance. I can confirm its authenticity." There was a long, uncomfortable pause. "I'm afraid I have a legal and ethical obligation to enforce it. The HOA's own complaint, which cited public safety concerns, is now a formal request for inspection and remediation. And since your document indicates that all of the docks are your property, the liability and the responsibility to bring them up to code falls to you." Elias felt a cold smile on his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand, Mr. Thompson, but the ordinance you just cited also gives you the authority to issue a mandatory tear-down notice for any structure that doesn't comply. My dock, as an existing structure built before the ordinance, is grandfathered in. Theirs, however, are not. They are all non-conforming." Thompson cleared his throat. "That is correct, Mr. Thorne. This is a very unusual situation. I have no choice but to issue the tear-down notices for every single one of those non-compliant docks. They have 14 days to comply or face immediate demolition." The conversation was surreal. Elias had turned the county's weapon against its owner, and the county was now obligated to pull the trigger. He hung up and drove home, the rattling of the truck a symphony of quiet, private victory. Over the next 48 hours, Lake Serenity was a pressure cooker. The local news had a field day with the story, painting Elias as the lone defender of his family's land against a cabal of greedy, oblivious millionaires. The headline on the front page of the local paper read, "He told them they couldn't take his lake. Now he's tearing down their docks." Tear-down notices were hand-delivered to every home. A final, irrevocable declaration of war. The community, once united in its quiet dismissal of Elias, now splintered into 1,000 angry factions. His phone rang again. This time it was a blocked number, and the voice on the other end was a low, simmering growl. "Thorne, this is Julian Vance. You think this is over?" "I think you made a tactical error, Julian," Elias said, his voice flat. He was no longer the frightened caretaker. He was the landlord. "You assumed I was poor, you assumed I was uneducated, and you assumed I was stupid. You assumed you could win by throwing money at a problem. You've now wasted your client's money, alienated your community, and forced the county to issue a demolition order on every single one of your client's prized possessions. What exactly do you think you've won?" "This isn't over, you rural hick," Vance spat. "This old ordinance is a joke. We will tie it up in court for years. We will get an injunction. My clients will not have their homes ruined by some pathetic man who lives in a shack. Your clients built on my property. They signed a document acknowledging that fact, and they filed a lawsuit that provided me with a detailed list of every single violation they have. You're welcome to sue, Julian. I'll see you in court. I'm sure the judge will be fascinated to hear your arguments." He hung up, the satisfying click of the button a final period on the conversation. But he knew it wasn't over. A predator like Vance would not accept defeat. He would lash out, and the next attack would be even more vicious, more personal. The next day, Elias received an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was simply, "Regarding the Arthur Thorne deed." He almost deleted it, but something stopped him. The body of the email was brief, typed in a clinical, emotionless font. "Mr. Thorne, my name is Eleanor Vance, Julian's sister. I am a legal historian specializing in archaic property law. My brother has told me about your case. I wanted to reach out to you directly, not to threaten you, but to warn you. My brother is not an honorable man. He will stop at nothing to win. He has put a team of researchers on your grandfather's deed. I believe they will discover a potential flaw in the title that could render your entire claim and every document that flows from it null and void. I cannot tell you what it is. as I do not wish to give my brother any more advantage than he already has. But I implore you, do your own due diligence. Find the flaw before he does." Elias stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. A flaw, a single, tiny, overlooked legal technicality that could unravel everything. His victory, his family's history, his home, all of it could be built on a foundation of sand. The irony was so cruel it felt like a physical blow. He had just won the battle only to discover that the war itself was a lie. The phone rang again, a familiar blocked number. This time, Elias didn't answer. He just watched the screen, a new kind of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. Julian Vance was coming, and he was bringing a new, more terrifying weapon. The email from Eleanor Vance was a ghost in the machine, a message from an honorable past that her brother had long since abandoned. The words potential flaw and null and void hammered Elias with a fresh kind of dread, colder and more terrifying than anything Julian Vance had thrown at him before. He had won the legal battle, only to find the very ground he stood on was an illusion. The blocked call ringing in his pocket was Julian, no doubt gloating, confident in the secret weapon his sister had inadvertently revealed. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't, not yet. He had to face this new enemy alone, in the quiet sanctum of his family's history. He went back to the attic. The legal documents he had already found felt fragile and insubstantial. He wasn't looking for proof of his ownership anymore. He was looking for proof of its frailty. He knew his grandfather, Arthur Thorne, had been a meticulous man, a quiet archivist of his own life. The flaw, if it existed, would be documented somewhere. He started with the oldest boxes, the ones smelling of dust and forgotten things, filled with documents dating back to his great-grandfather, Jedediah Thorne. He spent the next 2 days in a state of feverish, isolated obsession, fueled by cold coffee and the gnawing anxiety in his gut. He didn't answer the door when he heard a car pull up. He didn't return Julian's calls. He was lost in a paper labyrinth, a world of hand-drawn maps and legal script that felt a century away from the modern conflict he was embroiled in. He found old ledgers detailing the price of lumber, letters from a long-dead sister, and a single, faded photo of a younger Jedediah Thorne, standing proud and defiant by the lake he had claimed as his own. The flaw wasn't in the Thorne family's claim. It was in the land's history. Buried in a box of Jedediah's belongings, Elias found a single worn folder labeled Logging Co. and Easements. Inside was a single legal document, yellowed with age, and tied with a length of brittle twine. It was a formal easement agreement from 1902, signed by his great-grandfather. It granted a local lumber company the right to run a temporary pier and a small rail line across the eastern side of the lakebed to transport timber. In exchange for this right, the lumber company was to build a common-use landing and public pier on the lake's western shore, to be maintained in perpetuity for all property owners on the lake. Julian's team would have found this. They would have used it as irrefutable proof that the Thorne family's ownership of the lakebed was not absolute. It was burdened by a pre-existing legal right. This would allow them to argue that the HOA's docks were a modern private form of that same public easement. A legal loophole that would render his entire argument moot and allow the homeowners to continue using his property. But Jedediah Thorne had been a shrewd man, a man who understood a bargain. As Elias read deeper into the documents, he found a second, smaller document attached. It was a bill of sale dated 3 years after the initial easement. It detailed the transfer of the common-use landing and public pier and all associated responsibilities from the defunct logging company back to the Thorne family, for the sum of $1 and other considerations. The document was signed by both parties and notarized. His grandfather had not only acquired the lake, he had acquired the responsibility of the public pier as well, a responsibility he had never acted upon. Julian's team, focused on the flaw in the ownership, would have missed the bill of sale that transformed it into a powerful, forgotten right. Elias had not just found a flaw, he had found a hidden ace, a legal trump card that Julian Vance had not even considered. He now had the legal right to build a public dock, and the county ordinance he had just used to terrify the homeowners would force him to do so. The county would see this as a way to provide public access to the lake and would likely approve it immediately, and he had a perfectly legal way to pay for it. He drove to the Caldwell law office, the two pieces of paper feeling like twin thunderbolts in his hand. Caldwell's face lit up when he saw the documents. He spent another hour scrutinizing them, his initial surprise turning to a slow, professional awe. "Elias," Caldwell said, leaning back in his chair, "this changes everything. You don't just own the lake. You have a legal obligation and the right to provide public access to it. We will file a motion with the county immediately, seeking to enforce the 1905 bill of sale and our right to build this new common pier." "And the docks?" Elias asked. "The docks are a separate matter," Caldwell said, a mischievous gleam in his eye. "They can lease them from you, and you can use the revenue to build and maintain the public dock. This isn't about vengeance, Elias. This is about leverage. You're not tearing down their docks. You're using their own money to build a permanent public legacy on the lake they tried to privatize." The final confrontation was not in a courtroom or a press conference. It was a quiet, private meeting in Julian Vance's office, with the Homeowners Association present. The room was tense, filled with a silence as thick as the humid air outside. Julian, his face still pale from the press conference, sat behind his mahogany desk, a fortress of expensive wood and polished brass. "So, Thorne," Vance said, his voice a low hiss, "you've won a minor skirmish, but the injunction is coming. We will tie you up in court for years until you are bankrupt." Elias smiled, a slow, genuine smile that was full of the quiet confidence of a man who knows he has already won. He laid the documents on Julian's desk, the 1902 easement and the 1905 bill of sale. Julian Vance picked them up, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. He scanned the first document and his face broke into a cruel, knowing grin. "Ah, there it is, the flaw. The pre-existing easement. Your claim is not absolute. I told you, Thorne, you couldn't win this. We'll use this to get an injunction and a full dismissal." "Read the second one, Julian," Elias said calmly, "and then I'll tell you what I've decided to do with your client's docks." Julian's eyes darted to the second document, and his grin vanished. He read the bill of sale, his eyes wide with disbelief, then a chilling, profound horror. His own sister's warning, dismissed as a momentary weakness, had led him straight into an ambush. The flaw wasn't a flaw. It was a weapon. The very thing he had intended to use to invalidate Elias's claim was a powerful, legally binding right. Elias leaned forward, his voice a low, final blow. "You have a choice, Julian. Your clients can either continue to fight a losing battle, spend millions on legal fees to lose their docks, their property values, and their dignity, or they can lease their docks from me at a fair market rate for a period of 10 years. Mrs. Harding gasped. Mr. Davies's face was a mask of shock. "And what do they get in return?" Julian Vance asked, his voice a barely audible rasp. "They get the peace of mind of a legal right to use the lake," Elias said, a glimmer of light in his eyes. "And they get to be part of something bigger. I'm taking the revenue from the leases and building a new public common pier on the other side of the lake, just like the original ordinance intended. Your clients, the people who tried to claim my lake as their own, will now be paying for everyone in the county to use it." The silence that followed was a quiet and absolute defeat. Julian Vance had nothing left to say. He had no more moves. He had been so obsessed with winning that he hadn't considered the possibility that the man he was fighting had been preparing for this day his entire life. The lawyer was not just defeated, he was destroyed. Elias had not only reclaimed his property, he had turned his neighbor's greed into a public good. Elias walked out of the lawyer's office and back into the sunlight. He drove to the old splintered dock that had started it all. He sat on the edge, his feet dangling in the cool water, and looked out across the lake. The sunset painted the water in streaks of gold and fire, a beautiful, eternal canvas. The battle was over. He was home. He was a caretaker, but he was also the landlord. And the lake, in all its quiet, unyielding majesty, was finally, truly his.